What is fascinating for me as a political reporter is we've always thought that South Africa is an exciting place. Some people call it a dangerous place, particularly for money. And the rest of the world has seemed really safe and predictable and slightly boring. You know, international news is something a South African looks at when they're about to go to sleep because it's all so dull. And in the 4 days I spent at Davos at the World Economic Forum meeting, I got the feeling things have reversed slightly. Things have changed a little bit. The rest of the world is suddenly quite scared, and we're looking a little bit predictable. At least we know what we're dealing with. But what you're really starting to see, and what's wonderful about being in Davos, is watching power shift globally, so in the world. And what you had was the process of leadership in the world starting to really shift. And it was simple. Xi Jinping, the president of China, has basically said to the United States, "Make America great again, all you like. We'll lead the world. Thank you very much indeed." Now take this quote. So this is from Xi's speech. "Economic globalization was once viewed as the treasure cave found by Ali Baba in the Arabian Nights, but it has now become the Pandora's box in the eyes of many." China has its own strong, ancient culture, its own myths, its own beliefs, all of these things. He immediately is reaching to other myths around the world, to other stories around the world that everyone will understand and know. He's reaching out to the world with that and saying, "Come along with me." Just that, for me, was such an interesting quote about how he was connecting with his audience. Then there's his main point, and I would say of a speech like that, his main point was this: just blaming economic globalization for the world's problems is inconsistent with reality and will not help solve the problem. Do you think he thought it would have been undiplomatic to say Donald Trump is a liar? Because that is surely what he was doing, is he was basically saying, you're wrong and we're right. And of course, China is the country that arguably needs globalization more than anyone. You could argue if the Chinese economy slows down, the person most threatened is Xi Jinping. So the person perhaps most threatened by the end of globalization was the person giving this speech. And of course, he's right. I mean, he must be right, the way I understand the world, that globalization has been a force for good, must continue, and that you can't stop it, even if Donald Trump said last night he wants to actually go ahead and build that wall. But there's another point to make here as someone who watches politics, which is politics is about people moving into space and trying to take each other's space. So, in other words, you try and occupy the center ground, or you try and occupy the right or the left, or you try and occupy the space of leadership, or whatever it is. It's amazing how America is retreating here. They don't have to. Their economy is still much bigger than China. They can still project power in a much greater way than China can. And they've shown that with what's been happening in the South China Sea. But what we're seeing is that a year ago, roughly, everyone was talking about the Chinese stock markets, which seemed to have lost the plot. And the problem seemed to be, as I understood it, you couldn't actually quantify the value of investments in China. And people were talking about, is this the end of Chinese growth? Suddenly, because of Donald Trump, China is the person being asserted, is the actor who's actually taking space, only because Donald Trump is withdrawing from that space. And I think that's really interesting. It's quite funny, actually. As a South African journalist who focuses on politics, I'm usually asked the question, will we be all right? Will my children be all right in this country? Will my pension be safe? Will the president change? And what about Julius Malema and radical economic change? And who's going to be our next president? And will he take the oath wearing a beret? And suddenly, the people who are asking those questions have German and British and French accents. The Americans don't bother asking at the moment. And it's so interesting that these people are really quite scared. So for the first time in 3 or 4 generations, they don't know what is going to happen. And these are people who are at the top of a structure, so the structure got them there. They understand that structure. They feel they can control parts of that structure. And the structure is changing underneath them. And there's a real sense of some kind of fear because they don't know what is going to replace it with and what the world is going to be like in the next decade. All they know is what they know and what got them there may no longer be there, which I think is probably frightening for every politician. The source of this fear of the global elite is what they call the anger of the middle classes I call it Europe and North America. They call it the developed world for some reason. But it is becoming more and more obvious that what's leading to this is the huge rise in incomes for the richest 1 or 2% of the population, the sliding incomes of people in the middle classes. And for the first time since 1945, people in these countries think that their children's lives will not be better than their own. And that's really, that's not the deal. The deal is that you work hard so that your children have it better. I mean, I think anyone with children, I think, will understand that. That's what it's about. And suddenly, we get the sense that that's not what is happening. And that deal has been broken. And if you break the deal, there is going to be a radical response because you are really touching people at their most sensitive spot. And that, I think, is what's happened. But there's a much bigger point as a South African journalist I'd like to make here. And I was interested about Switzerland, of course, one of the world's richest countries, probably the highest standard of living anywhere. And it hasn't been affected by the kind of tension we've seen in Britain or the United States. And when you first ask the question, why is Switzerland so rich? You possibly first ask it when you're quite young, and your parents might say, well, it hasn't fought a war and it's been a neutral country for a very long time. And that's true. But there's something else here that I think was interesting, which is that in Switzerland there's been a general consensus about how to do things for a very long time. And by how to do things, I mean how to make decisions, how the political structure will be, how we will incorporate radical thought, how we will deal with social problems, and what kind of economic model we're going to have. There is a general agreement on what we're going to do. And after the Second World War in North America and Europe, there was consensus about what to do and how to do it. People agreed. And that consensus led to what the, unfortunately now, former US Vice President Joe Biden said at Davos. He called it the unparalleled success of the West. I mean, I don't think we could really argue with that. But look what happens when there's no consensus on big issues. Brexit, no consensus on Britain's relationship with the European Union, you get Brexit. There's no consensus on what should happen in the United States, and you get Donald Trump. And there's a panel with the Italian finance minister, Pier Carlo Padoan, who said on a panel that this was about the politics of no. So all you're doing is rejecting the sort of lack of consensus. So it's easy to reject the status quo by voting to leave the European Union, and it's easy to reject what's happened in the United States by voting for Donald Trump. The problem is there's no answer as to what to do next and to build that consensus about what to do next. But I think the person who probably put it best was Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF. And she said, if leaders don't get it now, they never will. And I think she's right. I want to say a couple of things about the performance of Team South Africa at Davos. We had what I would call unprecedented access to our politicians there. And I came away, as a political reporter, as a South African, I came away, I don't know how to say this, really optimistic. I'm a professional cynic. And I was like, wow, actually, I feel happier and more optimistic about what's going to happen than I have in quite some time. Now, one of the reasons is that South African media history was made at Davos. Cyril Ramaphosa did interviews. And I must say, he was also quite optimistic about the economy. So this is what Cyril Ramaphosa, our deputy president, has to say about the economy in 2017.
I have no doubt that 2017 ushers in a much more stable environment in our economy. We are, of course, like many other countries, going to be facing the slow growth that we went through. But what is important for us as South Africans is that we were able, even during the past year and even the previous year, able to withstand quite a number of the challenges that we faced. And we need to remain focused on fostering economic growth, but ensure that the economic growth that we should have as South Africa should be an inclusive type of growth. And the other important thing, of course, as South Africa is that we've got strong institutions, and strong institutions that proved that they are the shock absorbers to whatever shock that our country can be subjected to.
One of the reasons that Davos actually made me quite optimistic from a South African point of view was that all the business people and all the politicians were so comfortable in each other's space. And all of this suggests that in our search for consensus, some real progress, I think, has been made. The shock of Ntlantla has led to real work between business people, the banks in the main, because you were affected so badly, government, and then, of course, the labor unions as well. And that's what gives me that sense of optimism. So, being the good political journalist that I am, I went to go and find someone who understands the intersection between business and politics, because it's a very complicated intersection. I can't think of anyone better suited for this than Maria Ramos.
And I think that the team, the South Africa team that is here with its, its shoulders and its head held high, its shoulders out, and I think there is an optimism about what we're doing and about our country. Is it well founded? I think it's founded on a huge amount of work that's been done between government and business and labour, actually, because we've got labour representation here as well over the last 12 months.
So let me just sum up Davos 2017. Europe is scared of Brexit and the possible breakup of the EU. China is grabbing power in the vacuum being left by the United States. And everyone, and I mean everyone, is scared of Donald Trump. And our business leaders and our politicians seem to be getting along better than they probably have in the last decade. So if you saw a cheerful person at Davos, they were probably South African. All right, thank you very much indeed. Midday Report, 12 to 1. Thanks.